Elliot Monroe stared at the screen in disbelief. The numbers on the chart were plummeting in real time, and his entire world seemed to collapse in front of him. His company's future was hanging by a thread, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His fingers hovered above the keyboard, paralyzed by the shock. The phone rang beside him, but he didn't have the strength to answer. Claire Monroe, his partner, was pacing behind him, frantic. She had already seen the destruction of their hard work. "We have to act now, Elliot," she urged. But Elliot felt lost in the moment. Nothing made sense anymore. The market had crashed, but what hurt the most was the betrayal from within. Their trusted partner, Gary Thorne, had made a move that would cost them everything. The loss was personal, and Elliot felt the weight of it more than anything else. Claire continued talking, but Elliot wasn't really listening. His world had just shattered. The phone call from Claire Monroe had ended. Elliot Monroe, feeling the weight of the situation, sat in silence, trying to process the impact of the betrayal. His mind raced. Could this betrayal really be happening? How did they get here? The stakes were higher than ever, and Elliot knew they were quickly running out of time. It was clear that this wasn't just about market crashes anymore. The very people he trusted were sabotaging his vision. He had to make a choice. Either fight for the company or risk losing everything. Elliot Monroe stood up, his legs unsteady. As he paced across the room, his thoughts consumed him. He couldn't let Gary Thorne and the others destroy everything he had worked for. The decision ahead of him felt monumental, and he realized there was no turning back. Claire had already said it, they had no time to waste. Elliot Monroe took a deep breath and grabbed his jacket, ready to leave the office. The streets outside were still lit, but his thoughts were clouded. Claire Monroe stood beside him, trying to offer comfort but sensing his distress. "We have to go to the meeting," she said. "We can't waste any more time." He nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. They were meeting with potential investors, those who could help them climb out of this mess. Elliot Monroe could feel the weight of it all: betrayal, lost trust, financial ruin. But one thing was clear, he had no choice but to face it. As they drove, the silence was deafening. Every turn, every stoplight seemed like a choice that could change everything. Elliot Monroe glanced at Claire, her face a mixture of worry and determination. They were in this together, but would it be enough? The meeting was set in a sleek, modern conference room. Elliot Monroe sat at the table, facing 3 potential investors. The tension was thick, and their eyes bored into him. Elliot Monroe felt like an actor, reading lines he never prepared for. "What makes you think you can still recover?" one investor asked, his voice cold. Elliot Monroe fought to keep his composure. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he knew he had to keep calm. He couldn't afford to lose his nerve. "Because I believe in this company," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. Claire Monroe, seated beside him, exchanged a glance with Elliot, her hand brushing his for a brief moment. The unspoken bond between them was undeniable, but the question lingered: could they convince these investors? Elliot Monroe felt his future hang in the balance. The meeting ended in a tense silence. The investors were quiet, their decision looming. Elliot Monroe and Claire Monroe stood together outside the building, the weight of the moment heavy between them. "They didn't seem convinced," Claire Monroe said softly. Elliot Monroe didn't respond immediately. His mind was still replaying the conversation. What did they need to do differently? Elliot Monroe knew they were walking a tightrope, and one misstep could lead to ruin. He turned to Claire, his face hard. "We're not done yet," he said firmly. "We can make it through this. We have to." They stood for a moment, staring at the city, uncertain of what the next steps would bring. The road ahead was dark, but Elliot refused to give up. Not yet. Elliot Monroe sat back in his office chair, looking at an old photograph on his desk. It was a picture of him as a young boy with his mother, taken before the dream of success consumed him. He thought back to those simpler times, when life seemed full of possibility. Back then, he didn't understand the crushing weight of adult responsibilities, the sacrifices that would be required. Elliot Monroe was the son of a single mother, and he learned early on that if he wanted something, he had to work for it. But now, as the pressure of his crumbling business closed in, he wondered if his sacrifices had been worth it. Was he running from his past, or was he chasing an illusion of success? He had spent years building something from nothing, and now it was all slipping away. Claire Monroe noticed his distant stare and approached him. "You're thinking about it again, aren't you?" she asked softly. Elliot nodded, his expression unreadable. The flashbacks began to flood his mind, one after another. Elliot Monroe remembered the early days of his career, filled with hope, but also an overwhelming sense of uncertainty. He had tried several ventures before his breakthrough, each one leading to failure. But he kept going, driven by the idea that success was just around the corner. He thought of the late nights spent working, the conversations with mentors who offered both encouragement and harsh truths. They had warned him that business was a game of survival, a game that demanded everything. Yet somehow, he had always believed that his persistence would pay off. He had put everything into this business, from his savings to his heart. But now, sitting in the office that should have been the symbol of his success, he felt empty. Elliot Monroe's dream was unraveling, and all he could do was watch. The realization hit Elliot Monroe like a freight train. The first venture he ever started, years ago, had failed miserably. He had invested all his savings, believing it would lead to the breakthrough he so desperately needed. The disappointment from that failure still stung. It was the moment that defined everything that followed. But despite the sting of that loss, he had learned invaluable lessons that guided him through the tough years. The failures had shaped him into who he was now, determined, resilient, and always pushing forward. He thought about the many sacrifices he had made, time with friends, relationships that faded, the endless hours spent on business plans. Was it all worth it? The question lingered in his mind as he gazed at the framed photograph on his desk. Claire Monroe broke the silence. "You've come a long way, Elliot. You've built something, even if it doesn't feel that way right now." Her words were a reminder that success wasn't just about what was lost, but about how far they had come. The harsh truth began to settle in. Elliot Monroe realized that the lessons learned from past failures didn't always lead to success. Sometimes persistence wasn't enough. Sometimes it was about knowing when to pivot, to adapt, and to change course. Claire Monroe had been telling him this for weeks, but he hadn't been willing to listen. He was too focused on his dream to acknowledge that it might not be the right path anymore. The weight of his decision seemed heavier now. Claire Monroe's voice cut through his thoughts. "Maybe it's time we take a step back and reevaluate our options." Her words echoed in his mind as he considered whether they should sell off parts of the company, find a new investor, or walk away completely. The uncertainty gnawed at him, but he knew one thing. The road ahead would not be easy, and there would be sacrifices to make. Elliot Monroe stood at the window, looking at the city beneath him. The same city he had dreamed of conquering, now seemingly indifferent to his struggles. Claire Monroe stood beside him, the two of them lost in the quiet hum of the night. "What now?" she asked softly, her voice almost a whisper. The question was simple, yet its weight was immense. Elliot Monroe exhaled deeply, feeling the cold air from the window against his skin. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we can't give up, not yet." He turned to her, meeting her gaze. The unspoken understanding between them was clear. No matter how bad things got, they were in this together. And they would keep fighting, no matter the cost. Claire Monroe smiled faintly, a small but meaningful gesture of hope in the face of uncertainty. The confrontation with Victor Prescott, a 55-year-old ruthless investor, had finally come. Elliot Monroe knew this was a defining moment, one that could change everything. Victor leaned back in his chair, his steely eyes fixed on Elliot. "Do you really think you can still turn this around?" Victor asked coldly. Elliot Monroe swallowed, trying to steady his voice. "I have to," he replied firmly, despite the sinking feeling in his stomach. The meeting had begun with high hopes, but the tension was palpable. Victor Prescott was the kind of man who saw every setback as an opportunity to take control. Elliot Monroe wasn't sure he had the leverage to keep this battle from slipping out of his hands. But he was desperate, and desperation could sometimes breed the most dangerous of strategies. "If you want my money, you'll need to prove you can deliver," Victor said, his tone final. As Elliot Monroe walked out of the conference room, the weight of the meeting pressed heavily on his shoulders. Claire Monroe was waiting for him in the hallway, her eyes filled with concern. "How did it go?" she asked. Elliot Monroe ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident on his face. "Not well," he said. "Victor Prescott is asking for a level of control I'm not comfortable with. If we give in, we might lose everything." Claire Monroe raised an eyebrow. "What's our other option?" she asked. Elliot Monroe paused, unsure. They could try to raise funds from other investors, but they were running out of time, and Victor Prescott was a big player. The choice was clear. They were cornered, and the only way out might be to gamble everything on this deal. But could they trust someone like Victor Prescott? Could they even afford not to? The weight of the decision began to take its toll on Elliot Monroe. Sitting in his office later that day, he found himself staring at a blank computer screen, the cursor blinking endlessly. His thoughts were a tangled mess of doubt and fear. The pressure of the decision, whether to accept Victor Prescott's terms or find another way, gnawed at him. Claire Monroe sat across from him, offering him a quiet moment of solace. "We need to make a choice, Elliot," she said softly. "I know this is tough, but we can't keep running away from it. We've fought this hard, we can't back down now." Elliot Monroe looked up at her, his face torn between the weight of responsibility and the need to protect their dream. Could they really trust Victor Prescott? Or was this the end of the line? The decision had to be made. Elliot Monroe picked up the phone, dialing Victor Prescott's number. The cold rings echoed through the speaker before the call was answered. "You've made your offer," Victor Prescott said, his tone businesslike. "But I'm not sure you're fully aware of what's at stake here, Elliot. You can take the deal, or you can watch your company fall apart. The choice is yours." Elliot Monroe's pulse quickened. "I'm not going to sell out," he said, his voice firm. "But I am willing to make a deal. We'll negotiate the terms." There was a long pause on the other end, and Victor Prescott's voice was cold when he replied, "You'll need to convince me, Elliot. Prove you're worth my time." The stakes were rising, and Elliot Monroe had no idea what would happen next. The next morning, the tension in the office was palpable. Elliot Monroe had spent the night sleepless, debating whether he had made the right choice. The weight of Victor Prescott's demands was overwhelming. Claire Monroe was the first to arrive at the office, her face lined with exhaustion, but also determination. She looked at Elliot Monroe with a knowing gaze. "You did what you had to do," she said, her voice steady. "Now we need to make this work." Elliot Monroe didn't reply immediately. The choices ahead of them were difficult, but Claire was right. They had come this far, and he couldn't let fear stop them now. "We'll make it work," he said quietly, his resolve hardening. The battle was far from over, and Elliot knew the real challenge had just begun. The shock hit Elliot Monroe like a wave. The financial documents he had just reviewed revealed a devastating truth. Gary Thorne, his trusted advisor, had been embezzling money from the company. The betrayal was monumental. Elliot had always relied on Gary, believing him to be the one person who understood the business inside and out. The revelation left him reeling. Claire Monroe, standing beside him, read the documents over his shoulder, her face slowly turning pale. Is this real?" she asked, her voice trembling. Elliot Monroe didn't respond immediately, staring at the evidence in front of him. His world had just turned upside down. How could Gary have done this? What else was he hiding? Claire Monroe's voice broke through his thoughts. "We need to confront him. Now," she said firmly. Elliot nodded, his hands shaking. The betrayal was deeper than he ever imagined. Confrontation with Gary Thorne was inevitable. Elliot Monroe and Claire Monroe arrived at his office, and the tension was palpable. Gary Thorne, 45 male, with a smug expression, sat across from them, clearly expecting them. Elliot Monroe slammed the documents on the desk. "You've been stealing from us, Gary," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Gary Thorne didn't flinch, his face showing no remorse. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Elliot, but this is business." "You should've known better," Gary replied calmly. Claire Monroe stood behind Elliot, her arms crossed, anger rising in her chest. "This is more than just business. You've ruined everything we've worked for." The room felt smaller now, the tension building as the truth came out. Gary Thorne was unrepentant, and Elliot Monroe's rage boiled over. "You're fired," he said coldly. But Gary Thorne only smiled. "You can't fire me, Elliot, not yet." The conversation turned into a battle of wills. Elliot Monroe was losing control. The more Gary Thorne spoke, the more it became clear that this wasn't just about money, it was about power. "You think you can just kick me out?" Gary Thorne sneered. "You don't know what you're dealing with, Elliot. You're nothing without me." Elliot Monroe felt his stomach churn. Was Gary right? Had he relied too heavily on someone like him? Claire Monroe spoke up, her voice steady but filled with rage. "It's over, Gary. We found out everything. You're done." But Gary wasn't finished. "Not yet," he said, his eyes glinting with a dangerous edge. Elliot Monroe stood still, his thoughts racing. Was this truly the end of the line, or was there a chance to fight back? The decision felt heavier than ever. After the confrontation, Elliot Monroe felt an overwhelming sense of betrayal. The weight of Gary Thorne's words lingered in his mind. "You're nothing without me," Gary had said, and part of Elliot believed him. He sat alone in his office, his face buried in his hands. Claire Monroe entered quietly, her presence grounding him. "You did the right thing," she said softly. Elliot Monroe didn't look up. "Did I?" he muttered. "I've lost control of everything. Gary was the one who always knew what to do. Now I have nothing." Claire Monroe sat beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone, Elliot. We'll figure this out, together." But the question loomed large. Could they recover from this betrayal? Could they still save the company? Or was it too late? The next morning, Elliot Monroe stood in front of the office window, looking out at the city skyline. The world felt far away, and for the first time he felt small. His empire, the one he had worked so hard to build, seemed fragile, crumbling before his eyes. Claire Monroe entered the room, and the silence between them was thick. "We can still make it through this, Elliot," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You've made it this far, and you're not going to give up now." Elliot Monroe turned to face her, his eyes tired but resolute. "We're not done yet. I won't let it end like this," he said. They had been through too much to give up now. The battle wasn't over, but the road ahead would be more difficult than ever. The day of reckoning had arrived. Elliot Monroe stood in front of the boardroom, his heart pounding. Victor Prescott was seated across the table, his arms crossed, watching him with an expression of cold indifference. "This is it, Elliot," Victor said. "You've got one chance to make this right." Elliot Monroe knew that this deal was his last shot at saving everything. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "I'm not here to make things right for you, Victor," Elliot replied, his voice firm. "I'm here to make sure this company survives." The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. Elliot Monroe had fought so hard to get to this point, but now, in the face of Victor Prescott's demands, everything seemed fragile. Claire Monroe was seated at his side, offering a reassuring glance, but the tension in the room was palpable. Elliot could feel the stakes rising. One wrong move, and everything could come crashing down. The negotiation was brutal. Victor Prescott pressed harder, demanding more control over the company, but Elliot Monroe refused to back down. "You don't get to dictate the future of this company," Elliot said. His voice shook, but his conviction was clear. Claire Monroe leaned forward, her eyes locked on Victor. "If you want to buy us out, it's going to be on our terms, not yours." The tension between the two men was palpable, but Elliot felt a surge of strength. The road to this point had been long, filled with betrayal, loss, and struggle, but this moment, this decision, could change everything. He wasn't going to let it slip away now. Victor Prescott smirked, clearly underestimating Elliot, but the younger man stood his ground. "I'm not here to play games, Victor," Elliot said firmly. "I'm here to win." The stakes were higher than ever. Elliot Monroe had made his final pitch, but Victor Prescott was far from convinced. "You think you can just walk away with this company intact?" Victor scoffed. "It doesn't work that way." Elliot Monroe didn't flinch. He knew this was the moment that would define his future. "It does if we believe in what we've built," Elliot said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. The room fell silent, the weight of Elliot's words hanging in the air. Claire Monroe stood beside him, offering silent support, her face hard with determination. Victor Prescott leaned forward, studying Elliot carefully. "You have guts, I'll give you that," he said, almost begrudgingly. "But will it be enough?" The question lingered in the air, and Elliot knew that the next few moments would change everything. The silence in the room was broken by the sharp click of a pen as Victor Prescott finally made his decision. "All right, Elliot," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You've convinced me. The terms will be yours, but only if you can prove you can deliver." Elliot Monroe felt the tension in his body release, but the weight of Victor Prescott's words lingered. "I'll prove it," Elliot replied, his voice low but confident. Claire Monroe glanced at him, her eyes reflecting the relief they both felt, but she knew the battle was far from over. "We've got this," she whispered. Elliot Monroe nodded, knowing that this deal, this victory, was just the beginning. They had finally made it, but they still had a long road ahead. The future of the company was in their hands, and this was their moment to reclaim control. The final deal was sealed, but the relief was bittersweet. Elliot Monroe and Claire Monroe walked out of the conference room, the weight of the deal still heavy on their minds. "We did it," Claire said softly, her voice filled with a quiet triumph. But Elliot Monroe knew this victory wasn't without its cost. The road ahead would still be filled with challenges, but they had taken the first step. "We're not done yet, Claire," Elliot replied, his voice resolute. "This is just the beginning." As they walked down the hallway, the morning sun filtered through the glass windows, casting long shadows on the floor. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, Elliot Monroe felt hope. It was late afternoon when Elliot Monroe received the call. He could hear the urgency in Claire Monroe's voice. "You need to see this," she said, her tone sharp. Elliot Monroe stood up, instantly alert. He grabbed his jacket and headed to her office. The moment he entered, Claire Monroe handed him a tablet, the screen displaying a leaked financial report. Elliot froze. The report revealed a secret deal between Victor Prescott and an unknown third party, one that Elliot had never heard of. How could this have happened? Elliot Monroe whispered. Claire Monroe looked equally shocked. "This could destroy everything we've worked for." Elliot Monroe felt a chill run through him. The betrayal from Victor Prescott was worse than he imagined. "We need to act fast," he said, his voice strained. "This could change the whole game." Elliot Monroe paced back and forth in Claire Monroe's office, the weight of the new revelation settling heavily on his shoulders. "This isn't just about a bad deal," he muttered. "It's a full-on betrayal. Victor Prescott must have planned this all along." Claire Monroe sat at her desk, flipping through the documents on the tablet, her brow furrowed. "But why now?" she asked. "Why leak this now?" Elliot Monroe stopped pacing and turned to her. "Because he thinks he's won. He's trying to wipe us out before we can fight back." There was a brief silence as Claire Monroe digested the gravity of the situation. "We can't let this slide," she finally said, her voice unwavering. "We have to go public. Expose him." Elliot Monroe nodded, determination rising in his chest. It's time to take the gloves off. The decision to go public wasn't an easy one. Elliot Monroe sat in front of a press conference, his hands tightly gripping the podium. The room was filled with reporters, their cameras flashing as they waited for him to speak. He could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. Claire Monroe stood by his side, her eyes filled with resolve. Elliot Monroe cleared his throat and began. I stand before you today to expose a betrayal that threatens not just our company, but the entire financial sector. He paused for effect, the room going silent. We have uncovered a secret deal between Victor Prescott and an unknown third party, a deal that was meant to destroy everything we've worked for. The room erupted with questions, but Elliot Monroe held his ground. We will fight back, and we will win. Claire Monroe gave him an encouraging nod. The war was just beginning. The fallout from the press conference was immediate. Victor Prescott's response came swiftly, but it was filled with venom. Elliot Monroe watched as the media blitz turned against him. You think you can ruin me? Victor Prescott's voice echoed in the press release. I built everything. This is just a small setback. Elliot Monroe stared at the screen, his hands clenched into fists. Claire Monroe stood beside him, her expression hardening. He's underestimating us, she said. Elliot Monroe nodded, feeling the weight of the challenge ahead. We're just getting started, he muttered, more to himself than to her. The battle was far from over, but the first shot had been fired. And now, there was no turning back. In the days that followed, the battle for control escalated. Elliot Monroe found himself in meetings with high-powered lawyers, strategizing his next move. The fight for his company was no longer just financial, it had become personal. Victor Prescott wasn't just an opponent, he was a threat to everything Elliot Monroe had built. Claire Monroe kept a calm, steady presence by his side, reminding him that they were in this together. We'll get through this, she said one evening, her voice reassuring. But Elliot Monroe knew it wouldn't be easy. Victor Prescott was a formidable adversary, and the stakes were now higher than ever. Elliot Monroe stared out the window, looking at the city below, his mind racing. We're not done yet, he said softly, a new resolve forming in his chest. The fight was far from over, but he was ready for whatever came next. The courtroom was packed, and the tension in the air was palpable. Elliot Monroe and Claire Monroe sat at a long table, their eyes focused on the judge, who was about to deliver a verdict that could change everything. Victor Prescott sat across from them, his usual smug demeanor gone, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. Elliot Monroe's heart pounded as the judge read out the decision. In light of the evidence presented, the court rules in favor of Monroe Enterprises. The actions of Victor Prescott were deemed unethical, and the contract is void. Elliot Monroe felt a wave of relief flood through him, but the fight was far from over. Claire Monroe squeezed his hand, and they exchanged a brief look of silent understanding. Elliot wasn't sure if this victory would be enough to fully restore what they had lost, but it was a start. They had won the battle, but the war for their company had only just begun. The aftermath of the courtroom victory was bittersweet. Elliot Monroe and Claire Monroe walked out of the courthouse, the weight of the judgment still sinking in. The crowd outside was buzzing with reporters, eager to get a statement. Elliot Monroe stood at the podium, his hands clenched, his voice steady. Today is not just a victory for our company, but for every entrepreneur who has faced unfair opposition, he said, his voice carrying the emotion of the moment. We fought for what we believe in, and we will continue to fight for the future of this company. Claire Monroe stood beside him, her posture strong, her face calm but filled with pride. The crowd erupted in applause, but Elliot Monroe knew the road ahead would still be long and uncertain. We've made it through the hardest part, he said quietly to Claire. But there's still so much more to do. The phone call came later that day, and Elliot Monroe knew it was going to be important. He stepped into his office, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Victor Prescott's voice came through, still as smooth and calculating as ever. Congratulations, Elliot, Victor said, his tone laced with thinly veiled sarcasm. You've won the battle, but don't think you've won the war. Elliot Monroe stood silently, feeling the weight of Victor Prescott's words. I don't need your congratulations, Elliot replied, his voice low but firm. What I need is for you to leave us alone. Victor Prescott chuckled darkly. You'll see, Elliot. I always get what I want. The line went dead, leaving Elliot Monroe standing in the dimly lit office, his heart racing. Claire Monroe entered, her eyes locking onto him. What did he say? She asked. Elliot exhaled deeply. He's not finished yet. The days following the phone call were filled with frantic meetings, late-night strategy sessions, and a mounting sense of urgency. Elliot Monroe and Claire Monroe spent every waking moment preparing for whatever Victor Prescott had planned next. They knew that victory in court didn't guarantee peace. The battle was just beginning. Claire Monroe sat across from Elliot Monroe, her face tired but determined. "We need to plan our next move," she said. "We've exposed him, but he's going to come after us in ways we can't predict." Elliot Monroe nodded, his thoughts racing. "We can't let him get to us. We need to outsmart him, play the long game." But deep down, Elliot Monroe knew it wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about survival. "We'll do whatever it takes," he said firmly. "We're in this together." The final confrontation was inevitable. Victor Prescott had pushed them to their limits, and now it was time for Elliot Monroe to take the reins. Claire Monroe stood beside him, her eyes locked onto him with quiet support. They entered the boardroom, and Victor Prescott was already seated, waiting. "I knew you'd come crawling back," Victor said, his voice dripping with contempt. Elliot Monroe didn't flinch. "I'm not here to beg, Victor," he said, his voice firm. "I'm here to take control of what's mine." Victor Prescott smirked, but it was clear he didn't have the upper hand anymore. Elliot Monroe had the final word. "You've lost, Victor," he said quietly. "It's over." The room fell silent as Elliot stood tall, feeling the weight of victory settle in. They had won, not just the battle but the war.